Hi and welcome to this week's episode on Amplify. My name is Sanchi Singh and I'm so glad that you could join us here. So today I will be looking into cities and climate change. Cities have an effect on and are affected by the climate emergency. As more than 2/3 of the world's population is estimated to live in cities by 2030, there are several issues that need to be addressed. Transport, mobility, housing, health, livelihoods, and so on. Cities are responsible for 70% of global CO2 emissions, and considering that 90% or over 90% in fact of all urban areas are coastal, very quickly we're confronted with just how vulnerable cities truly are and also the key role that they could play in fighting climate change. But building resilient cities isn't just limited to investing in green infrastructure, urban planning, better waste management, etc. Although the value of these policies is undeniable, a key part of building resilience in cities relates to building resilient communities. And there is no community more susceptible to the various manifestations of climate change, such as floods, droughts, storms, and pandemics, than those that are living in informal settlements or slums. So my focus for today is actually looking at informality and how one of the biggest slums in Asia, Dharavi, fares when it comes to being equipped to meet all of these different challenges. Hi and welcome to this week's episode of Amplify, where we are talking about the effect of climate change on our cities and what it means to build resilience in them so that we are better equipped to face these challenges. And I have with me today Rahul Srivastava and Matias Echanove, urbanologists and co-founders of Urbz, an experimental action and research collective specialized in participatory planning and design. They work with various stakeholders such as citizens, associations, local governments, private clients, etc., and they have teams in other cities, including Bogota, Sao Paulo, Geneva, and Seoul. And I'm so glad that they have found time to do this. Rahul is joining us from sunny Goa. Matias is joining us from Geneva. And thank you so much for finding time for this, guys. I really appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us. Looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for being here. So can you just start off by telling us about what gap you set out to fill when you decided to start Urbz?
So I think when we met, Rahul and I, both of us were working in different parts of the world. I was in Tokyo at the time, and Rahul was in Mumbai. And we actually shared an approach from also very different disciplinary point of views because of perspectives. I was doing urban planning, and Rahul is an anthropologist. But both of us were looking at the kind of the neighborhood as a scale of intervention, and we're looking at how people kind of shape their neighborhoods in different ways. So, what are the processes in place in the creation of a habitat and the collective production of a habitat? So, when we started talking, we immediately saw that actually those dimensions of anthropology and urban planning, should come together. And they should come together to inform, first of all, to kind of create a common vision and common plan of action, and also to kind of start a dialogue with policymakers, urban planners, whoever had the authority of helping people in building their neighborhoods. And we started in Dharavi, Koliwada, and at the time the neighborhood was threatened by the Dharavi redevelopment project. And the coalies were trying to kind of come up with their own plans, and we just did a 1 week long workshop there with about 120 people, half of them from Koliwada, half of them from all over the world, looking at many dimensions of the neighborhood. And after this, we immediately kind of realized that this was really something that we could develop into a practice. And the best place to establish this practice was Dharavi itself. So this is how we started.
And just to add to that, for us, this idea of a resilient neighborhood and a homegrown neighborhood were one of the defining sort of concepts because we felt that the level of agency which a neighborhood had. And Dharavi was a place which, according to us, had a very high level of agency. It was self-organized. It could, deal with crisis in a very efficient way. And it also represented a way of building an environment, a physical environment, which for us showed a lot of potential as a source of learning for urban planners everywhere. So even though it was considered to be a place which was seen to be dysfunctional or had very limited infrastructure, which is true, it does have limited infrastructure, but it was also a place for us which taught us a lot about resilience. And that is something which has been a very important part of our learning from there.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned how Dharavi sort of taught you and sort of displayed this resilience, because a lot of conversations on development itself focus on the removal or like the upgradation of slums as part of moving towards this higher standards of living or towards a smart city initiative. And so through your work, have you found that slums are actually transitional, that in due course of time they will be or they ought to be absorbed by the formal sector?
See, for us, we don't really make this distinction between the formal and informal. We find it hugely dismissive, because when you look at the dynamics in place in neighborhoods which are so-called informal or which are labeled slums, we see that actually, whether it's the economy, whether it's the culture, whether it's the technology, that it permeates the entire society. It's not; those are not kind of autonomous zones or really ghettos in the way we imagine. In fact, they are fully connected and enmeshed in a larger context. In fact, they're often also produced by the context in different ways. So, one of the big inspiration we had from the start, to respond more directly to your question, is post-war Tokyo, which really was redeveloped by residents themselves, because after Tokyo was flattened by US firebombs, it was really burned to the ground, almost the majority of the city. The occupation government decided to really focus on investing in infrastructure development and industry, and left urban development to people. So people did what they knew. They kind of self-organized. They looked at the skills that were present, the artisanship. They looked at the businesses they could operate from their neighborhoods, and slowly, incrementally, actually not so slowly, the neighborhoods were rebuilt, but they were rebuilt without planning at all, and which created very interesting, very intricate, very dense, low-rise, mixed-use kind of habitats that to this date, still characterize a city like Tokyo. So, for us, we don't see anything wrong with that typology, the typology of the unplanned, the typology of the incremental. In fact, we think that it's a totally legitimate typology and type of urbanization and process of urbanization as well. And if you consider it to be legitimate, then you can start looking at it from a different perspective, from as an urban planner, and look at how it can be improved. Because of course, there are many things that need to be done to kind of help the neighborhood improve itself. So this is really where we put our focus: is what are people already doing to develop their neighborhood, and what else do they need? How can they be supported in the work they're doing?
And the fact that a lot of economic activities happen in Dharavi, a lot of economic activities can even happen from spaces where people live. The kind of arrangements people have made between live, work, and play in the context of the same neighborhood are ideals actually which a lot of new urbanists are also talking about. So all over the world, it is accepted that cities should actually have a greater proximity about all these activities, spatially and socially. Now, places like Dharavi, other places in India also which are like Dharavi, already embody this. And this is one reason why these places are actually resilient. We wrote recently on our website a story of how there were people responding to the pandemic by making masks in Dharavi. And the fact that the place like Dharavi could actually produce masks is a testimony to the fact that it is already part of a very active economic environment. And yet there were so many other policy-based restrictions which never allowed this to emerge fully. So in moments of crisis, the resilience of Dharavi which is linked very strongly to its enmeshing of economic and residential and recreational activities, is something which is often ignored. And that is one concrete example of what Matias was talking about. That there is a lot over here which can be used by urban planners everywhere, and we definitely need to stop looking at neighborhoods or even urban context in terms of formal and the informal. This is a very false and problematic dichotomy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a pertinent point that you made there, because I remember at the beginning of April, if we just talk about COVID-19 and how Dharavi navigated that, just at the beginning of April, when I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that was when the first case sort of emerged from Dharavi, and then everybody was sort of panicking because they were like, how is Asia's biggest slum going to navigate that when there are no avenues for social distancing and, there's like cramped quarters. But now Dharavi has managed to flatten the curve, and I think that's quite remarkable. So can you just talk about what happened there and how Dharavi sort of became the shining example for the rest of Mumbai, which is still under lockdown and we're still in red zone and we're still sort of battling this crisis as we speak?
So we have not really had a direct experience of this phase, because obviously we could not be in Dharavi at this time. We have an office, but the office was locked up. But we have been consistently carrying, sort of updates from Dharavi through our team by talking to people on the phone. So this is now almost our 7th or 8th edition on our website, which is a Dharavi update, which is really about how Dharavi is coping with the virus. And we follow the trajectory right from the first case on the 1st of April to constant anxiety in the global and the local press, and then the flattening which happened and a sense of celebration, which everybody is still very cautious about, but it's a very, very complex and mixed story. So there are community leaders who believe that, yes, Dharavi in the past also has responded very well to crisis because of a lot of local organization. And while the municipal authorities, while the police, while the medical staff in the city were focusing on Dharavi, anticipating a huge crisis, they also came across a very well-organized local set of networks which helped them in implementing their tasks. So whether it was having constant scanning of the community of very large number of people, whether it's about putting people into quarantine, finding out in very micro neighborhoods what are the containment zones which have to be done, nothing of this could have happened had it not been for the fantastic level of local organization which the residents of Dharavi always show, which is evident in the economic activities, which is evident in the way in which they manage to, compress a lot of human living in very tiny spaces. So things which were considered to be perhaps a cause for a greater breakdown also contributed in many ways to a more efficient handling of the situation. But at the same time, if you look at a Dharavi update, this week's Dharavi update, you will see that people were also skeptical about inflated numbers. They also said that there was a lot of misinformation being spread. So the so-called transition is not necessarily as dramatic. It's also a mix of what actually happened and the way it was being reported based on expectations, so on and so forth. But what nobody can deny is the fact that there was a convergence of a good official intervention and a very strong local organization which happened together. Also, there are these other lateral factors. For example, a lot of Dharavi residents actually belong to a dual household family network. So anyway, in certain seasons, they go back home. So in a moment like this, when the economic security was affected, many of them left. So figures between 100,000 to 150,000 people leaving Dharavi and going back to their villages was also cited as a reason why the numbers reduced in Dharavi. However, what a lot of people felt is that, well, actually you should see this as a resource. The fact is that people can live in Dharavi in very dense conditions because they belong to a much larger extended spatial framework where they have a dual household family. So this is also a resource which Dharavi has. The fact that people can go home and come back. A lot of people whom we spoke to said that they are waiting for things to improve and for some economic activity to start, and then they will return. So this is perhaps, the kind of learning we did through our telephone interviews and talking to community leaders and, of course, covering the press to show how things changed in Dharavi.
And you mentioned, I think, somewhere, Matias, the word legitimacy. And Rahul, you're talking about the economic role that Dharavi plays and how Urbz essentially does not distinguish between formal and informal. But the thing is that even though you may not distinguish, slums are considered informal, and that sort of seeps into the kind of policies that are being made by government, not just the Indian government, but governments in other global South countries as well. So if these informal settlements sort of exist on the margins to the state, how does that sort of affect the people who are living and working and contributing to the country's economy?
The notion of the informal is not something which is part of actually the policy lexicon. The notion that is used is the notion of slum, a slum notified area or slum area. And Dharavi is a slum area, and 60% of people in Mumbai are said to be living in slums. Those are official categories, and they have it has very clear consequences when a settlement is labeled a slum. And initially, it was very progressive. When the category emerged to be notified as a slum area, meant that a settlement had like a fast track access to urgent infrastructure. So water pipes could be brought and shared by a few houses. Community toilets could be put in place. So all the way up to the kind of late 80s, neighborhoods, settlements were really kind of like trying hard to be recognized as being slum areas. What happened then in the 90s was completely changed this notion, because suddenly you could enter and be a slum, but how could you exit this label? How could you from being a slum become a neighborhood? And there's no path out except redevelopment at the policy level. The only way in which you can go from slum to neighborhood is through redevelopment. And that's kind of like a total policy failure. And there was experimentations, including in Mumbai, of slum upgrading, and they've been very successful. But somehow, because the real estate became so hot, starting the 90s in Mumbai, in other parts of India also, suddenly the notion was that you could make money with this land, which was often government land formerly. So the land could be sold to promoters, to developers who would then, just rehabilitate the slum dwellers in high-rise housing, slum redevelopment authority schemes. So, this is really what happened. So, yeah, that's the category of the informal. You see, like, why we're not using it is that the connotation for the informal is something which, first of all, the word evokes something which has no form, no shape, no logic, which is probably kind of like dysfunctional, which is probably illegal also. That's the kind of like lexical field of the word informal. What we actually see when we start observing and looking at the dynamics in place is something that we qualify of homegrown. What we think is more interesting, if you want to kind of create a category to define a certain type of urbanization, we think the homegrown is very interesting, because the homegrown just says that a place has been developed from within with local forces. And that's is something which is really interesting to look at. We start thinking, oh, really? I mean, there are forces within the neighborhood that actually contribute to its development. Should we not involve them in the project for improving it, for making it a neighborhood? So, this is kind of our response to the kind of word informal.
Yeah. Rahul, would you like to add something to that?
No. I think that's already a very good exposition. Explanation of it. So that.
Yeah. And we've talked a little bit about COVID-19, but we've also, in Mumbai at least, we've also sort of had we have actually had our first cyclone, right? We've also had Cyclone Nisarga. And so when we talk about resilience, what does resilience mean when it comes to facing natural disasters? Because naturally slums like Dharavi and others are quite vulnerable to floods, storms. So how do they sort of cope and navigate that?
So basically, it's the city as a whole is extremely vulnerable to climate change and these extreme weather conditions, which are becoming more and more routine, which are also connected to climate change. One of our advisors is Mr. Amitav Ghosh, who wrote a wonderful book on climate change, The Great Derangement. And he has a chapter on Mumbai in which he points out that the city is particularly vulnerable because of its geographical location, because of its his embeddedness in the Arabian West Coast, which is actually going to show increasing cyclonic activity. And so it is not just about Dharavi alone, or it's not just about neighborhoods which are homegrown or which are perceived to be particularly more vulnerable, but the city as a whole. Exit points are limited. It is surrounded by water on all sides, cyclonic activities. Even the recent one shown that the impact on infrastructure can be very extreme. So there has to be a lot of official, concerted efforts on behalf of every government department and every other major institution in the city to deal with what is going to be, of course, a very catastrophic event if it is not prepared for adequately.
Yeah. And do you think that, because for me, I've sort of all the policies or all of the narrative that currently exists sort of focuses on, at least when it comes to sort of developing a green policy or an environmental policy, sort of exists on energy and renewable resources. And so do you think that there is this sort of policy making that's just sort of ad hoc, that's just reactive to disasters such as the cyclone Nisarg that happened, or such as floods that have happened previously in Mumbai? Do you think it's just simply reactive and there's this overemphasis on renewable resources or energy policy in general as opposed to sort of building resilience?
The environmental discourse, like many other forms of political discourse, always presents an ideal starting point. But we never have an ideal starting point. We are always confronted with a legacy from the past, which is always messy. This is something which Matias and me have felt is a very important way of understanding our urban horizon. It's not only about energy, it's not only about environment, it's not only about urban planning. We always presume that there is a pristine moment from which we have to start. The fact is that we live in a context where there is a certain accretion of history, of old acts, old ways of doing things, and we have to find a way to plug into it, and then with more enlightened, more informed knowledge, start to make shifts. But if we always expect for a totalizing shift, it's going to be very difficult. And if we want to bring out our experiences from our work in urban planning, we can say that there's a lot of openness and a lot of willingness to experiment in neighborhoods like Dharavi, largely because the neighborhoods themselves are extremely flexible. They have a network of construction activities where people are willing, and they're willing to experiment with new materials which can respond to energy crisis. But at the same time, a neighborhood like this cannot do it alone. The city as a whole has to do it. As a whole, we have to start having more realistic goals year by year, decade by decade, to say this is how the city is going to start shifting its energy dependence. So the rest of the city, for most of middle class, upper middle class people who live in Mumbai, and they live in apartment blocks, etc., even putting water harvesting, even shifting into solar energy, etc., are things they can do. And these are, and these can become therefore aspirational for everybody, including the poor neighborhoods. But the shift has to happen very practically. It should definitely, work at both levels. Recognize what's happening on the ground, work with the flexibility and openness of people, small builders, some small contractors who can help improve infrastructure in micro environments, by addressing issues of water, electricity, sewage in a manner which is practical, pragmatic, strategic. And at the same time, the city as a whole should also develop a much more pragmatic way of changing its energy consumption, changing the way it is looking at construction materials. But this has to be concerted. These things cannot be only about one particular kind of neighborhood.
Yeah. Matias?
No, I mean, I think that covers a lot. One thing I would just simply add is that it's not, so much about one type of neighborhood versus another. It's also about, poverty. And if you live in a neighborhood which is seen to be, formal because it's been redeveloped and it has the shape of high-rise buildings and it's a slum rehabilitation authority building, it's a rehab, but you have very poor infrastructure, and the concrete is also kind of being attacked by saline air, and very quickly you'll find yourself in conditions of extreme vulnerability. Actually even more than the condition that you were coming from before. The so-called slum. So I think it's just important to look at this. There's like a dimension of it's not so much about the slum versus the rest of the city. And the other thing I just want to also add is that when we look at how cities are made resilient, it's also, of course, through a lot of public investment. And one thing that has been happening in countries around the world, especially as the world was kind of growing economically globally, is that the share of public wealth versus private wealth has decreased. And this is really, it's really what a city like Mumbai really needs the most. It needs more public wealth. It needs more wealth to be invested in public spaces, in pedestrian spaces, in open spaces, in infrastructure also to make it more resilient towards disasters. This is really the kind of things that makes everybody in the city, feel much richer and much more comfortable, independently of how much you can earn and what is your background.
Yeah. And in Mumbai, at least, I think we can get on to sort of the work that Urbz does in other cities in a minute. But in Mumbai, at least, there's sort of this hegemonic, overwhelming presence of the private sector and them sort of pushing all of these development practices. And how do you think that sort of very limited, very myopic definition of what development means affects people in Mumbai, and not just people, like you said, who are particularly or perceived to be particularly vulnerable to these changes?
There are many ways in which people are affected. Some are very direct, some are more indirect. A direct way in which people are affected is through real estate speculation. Simply when you see that in a city like Mumbai, and that was 10 years back, we don't know about the latest numbers from the census, but there were 500,000 empty flats. You start realizing that development has come at the cost of pushing people out. And this is actually what happened in the first decade of the year 2000. South Mumbai has lost 8% of population. So, development can mean many different things to many different people. And of course, we have to be very attentive at promoting the kind of development which allows value to be generated through use and not through speculation. And this is unfortunately not what is happening in the city now.
Yeah, I think particularly with what's happening with the environmental impact assessment, where they're trying to sort of scrap that, and what happened previously with RA Forest, I think this kind of development particularly is not just affecting people and their livelihoods, but also, of course, endangering biodiversity and sort of just accelerating our path to the imminent looming climate crisis.
That's an excellent example of really public wealth, of something which is beneficial to the entire community of people living in Mumbai, moving into private hands and kind of really something important getting lost for the population.
Mm. And can you tell me about the work that you do in other cities in the global south, such as Bogota and Sao Paulo? Do you think that there's like sort of a lot of overlapping that potentially happens? So there's some things that you learn about slums in Mumbai, and then you sort of realize that, this sort of is similar to our experience working in Bogota or in Sao Paulo. Do you find that, or do you find that there are more differences?
No, so we were really fascinated in Sao Paulo. We went there quite a few times over the course of 2 years, working on a project in Paraísopolis, which is considered to be also one of the largest favelas in Sao Paulo. And one of the time we went with Bao Corde, who's an activist from Dharavi, who's about now, like in his 70s and still as active as ever. We work a lot with him. He's our advisor. He's always been part of what we do in Mumbai. And when he went there, and we went to the favela, which is supposed to be such a bad environment, he found it so nice. He was like, "This is so nice, and it's so clean, and people are so nice and friendly." And, to see through his eyes was amazing. At the same time, you could also tell that Mumbai had some kind of, an energy that was missing in Sao Paulo. And I think generally that you don't necessarily find in many other parts of the world in terms of the ability of people to be entrepreneurial, to kind of really, develop their own neighborhood, to just the skills that are there. The kind of social organization is very strong. So yeah, I mean, you see that there are plus and minuses in different places, but ultimately, one thing that for us was really important to realize, and we've seen it not just in the context of homegrown neighborhood or so-called slums. We realized that actually there's a certain typology which is quite universal and which is human scale, and that is often been dismissed, and that so the typology is there. We started doing collages of Sao Paulo and Mumbai, of Tokyo and Mumbai, and always Dharavi, showing of Italian towns on Dharavi, to kind of start showing that, this is quite universal. If you let urbanization happens, this is what happens, and it's not that bad. Maybe it needs a little bit of intervention and improvement here and there, but we're on a good track over there. And we also create the kind of habitat that works with the local economy, which is actually quite resilient also and sustainable. So we just feel like there's so much there which is just before our eyes, and we've not been able to really kind of take it seriously. And that is, I would say, something that we've seen very strongly connecting, different parts of the world. We see the same kind of potential, for self-improvement. And this is really kind of stimulating.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. That's really a very good description of our interactions over the last few years. And we are, I don't think I can add more to that.
Yeah. I remember when I was studying, there was this guy in my course. He is British, and he's a little bit ignorant. And I find that quite a few people in Britain are ignorant. And he was sort of talking about Slumdog Millionaire. And it's interesting how sort of people just assume that I am like the authority on slums and Slumdog Millionaire and whatever else, because I was like the token Indian student in that class. And he was asking about like, is it true, like about Slumdog Millionaire and all of that? And like sort of there's just this perception, right, that Dharavi is sort of this decrepit, sort of crumbling apart, like cesspool of people who are sort of just trying to clamber out of that and out of their poverty. And whereas in actuality, there's so much research, and I know that business schools themselves sort of encourage students to actually study Dharavi as an example of an economy that's actually worth, I think, $1 billion or something like that. So I think it's definitely such an enterprising community, and it's an example, and it's just so much more than a slum, and definitely much more than Danny Boyle's Slumdog Millionaire.
I just want to say, just in defense of the ignorant, friend. I mean, ignorance is basically, what we all start with. We have to understand that we are ignorant of certain context until we give it time, and that's why we have to start respecting the local residents as a resource. It's someone who's actually knowledgeable, who can help us navigate, find what we need, understand how things are done in certain specific context. So, I feel, I think ignorance is entirely excusable. Like we can understand it and we can excuse it easily. What is not so easily, that we cannot forgive so easily is when you refuse to kind of, or when you think and you have preconceptions. And that we find happens a lot also among the middle class in Mumbai, for example. And so it's everywhere, that sometimes things which are very close to you, and it's fine not to know. I mean, why would you, if you've never been there and if your life takes you elsewhere, even if you're in Mumbai and you live very close to Dharavi or whatever, not everybody has kind of a mission to go and start understanding. But, you should not kind of assume that, this place is filthy, it's dangerous, it's disorganized, because simply, this is pure prejudice.
Yeah. I'm actually just curious to know, because I've heard of this, that there are tours that sort of take tourists through Dharavi. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's a complex thing. I mean, we would, it's very easy to diss something like that, right away. And we are not in favor of doing that either because, you know, our office based in Dharavi also attracts people from different parts of the world who come, students come and spend time, and everything can be reduced, just to being something, through a very snide remark. So we don't, sort of completely ignore it. But on the other hand, yes, the intention of the person coming to visit any place, not only Dharavi, you can have a very, very uninformed gaze in Udaipur or Jaipur also by a tourist. So it's not, and in India as a whole, can also play up, from the Maharaja narrative to the tigers to we've also, played up on this notion of creating stereotypes. And then within that, to isolate and say that, a certain kind of tourism is particularly problematic, it's not a very a straightforward thing to do. Also because, yes, having a look at poverty up close and seeing that as if it is some kind of an experience is, of course, slightly perverse. Nobody can deny that. But that is not true only of, about the context of Dharavi. That gaze is there everywhere. It can be in Agra when you go to the Taj Mahal also.
Yeah.
So this is a deeper problem about objectification of what tourism means. How do people, perceive the other and how reductive that othering is. So we must look at slum tourism also as part of a larger narrative around tourism as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Because I think sometimes it can be a little like, you see all of these people who are sort of photographic and sort of, quote unquote, consuming poverty or a certain lifestyle that Dharavi has. But on the other hand, like you rightly said, I think it really depends on the intention of the person. And India definitely plays up on its colonial past as well to sort of attract tourists. But yeah, that's sort of a conversation for another day. I was just curious to see what your opinion on that was. And I think towards sort of close our episode, I just wanted to ask, what do you hope are some of the key takeaways that people should have in mind moving forward once the sort of pandemic is a little bit behind us or sort of like, at least until we've managed to flatten the curve?
Yeah, no, it's a really tough one, because, in a way, it's not just all about the pandemic, it's about how the world was before. There's this very kind of interesting slogan that has emerged, which is no return to the abnormal, like as if the world before, was already not, functional. In fact, COVID is probably not the worst crisis that the world was experiencing. There's many things which are more urgent, more problematic, including obviously the environment, poverty, inequality, and especially, if we could just keep one thing, which I think would be a good one, to take on, is to say that, we really understood, we really saw that there was something to be found in between a model which was really kind of totalitarian and saying that, we're going to control this by locking everybody down in a certain way and imposing tracking people and everything. And a model which was, fully based on individual liberty and just, we're not going to, tell you to do anything, you're just going to do whatever you want. And, then we saw that, okay, there's something in between that we really need to kind of reach at. And I think this something is a sense of community. And this sense of community is something that we can really find at the local level, at the neighborhood level. And this is really something that worked quite efficiently in the context of Dharavi, as Rahul explained before. Saying that if it was not for this pre-existing community network, this capacity of people to mobilize as one collective, the crisis would have been so much worse. It's not over. So yeah, I think this is something to look at, like really preserving the kind of sense of individual freedom, yes, not at the price of thinking about the collective, and thinking about the collective, not at the price of also reducing the individual freedom. So really kind of this in between, which I think can maybe be found in India if only the government was to trust people a bit more.
Right. Exactly. And just imagine, if the same partnership emerged again between local civic officials, local community leaders in Dharavi, to address issues to do with improvement of civic infrastructure, sewage, water supply. Again, working closely to make sure there are more community toilets that workers, both migrant and settled, all of them have access to decent infrastructure. And the same partnership continued. There would be a complete transformation of how the neighborhood functions, and and all that it can contribute would increase exponentially. So that is the kind of learning we've got.
Yeah, and I know that Matias is going to roll his eyes at this question, because when I sent him the outline, he was like, narrow your questions down, they're too huge. But I still have to ask this question. So is that what you sort of imagine Mumbai to look like in 2030, which is, sort of the action plan in the UN SDGs and everything, sort of the magical year when everybody's supposed to have decarbonized and we're sort of supposed to have made significant progress when it comes to sustainable development? What do you think Mumbai should look like or will look like given the current status quo in 2030?
For me, I'm like a huge Mumbai fan. I'm just like a total romantic when it comes to Mumbai. I love it as it is, with all the noise and the mess and the people, and I just I find it incredibly charismatic and charming and everything. But obviously,
that's so sweet.
That's true.
Where is your Gully Boy rap? Why did you not come prepared with a Gully Boy rap singing an ode to Mumbai? I'm very disappointed.
No. I've always been like, I fell in love with Mumbai the first time I landed. People were throwing colors and there's music everywhere. And I was like, what is this? I mean, it's like, this is amazing. And taxi stopped. I stopped the taxi right there with the taxi driver who went into one procession. And, I came back, fully red. I was like, this is my city. I belong here. I want to stay forever. And that's how I stayed for so long and, created strong bonds and roots. But, obviously, there are many things which, could be going better. I mean, just the one thing that would just make the one single thing that would make the city the most magical place ever is if we could, if the seawater was, cleaned up, and if we didn't have all this kind of like, gutter water going straight into the beach. Because imagine if we could all, go to Chapati Beach and Juhu Beach and everywhere and just like swim over there. I mean, this would just be the best ever. It would just beat Rio by far,
Yeah.
So that would be my dream. And it's not it's not an impossible dream to realize. It's quite. I mean, cities have managed. If you can do it in Rio, you can do it in Mumbai for sure.
Yeah, you can do it in Chicago. Chicago in the 80s had a stinking river, and it's totally transformed. So I think keeping this particular vision, which Matias said about the water alone, how do we just improve the entire water system of the city, right down to its sewage, drainage, that singularly will transform the city's experience. I mean, I totally vote for what Matias had said. And at the same time, if I know, and other things, for example, to do with pollution, etc., are functions of larger changes which the city will have to make, which the world is making. It's about using less polluting material in the more public transport, less petrol, etc. And those transformations will happen. But if the city can take a very concerted effort to clean up its water systems, understand its relationship with the monsoon better, not fight it the way it is doing now. There are a lot of very interesting studies to talk about the city as a city which can thrive with the monsoons, not feel scared of it. And if we can somehow relate to the sea, the oceans, and its water systems, then the city can really be one of the best cities in the world.
Oh, I love that. I love that this ended on this incredible, this ode and love song to Mumbai. I think that's such a lovely note to end it on. And thank you so much for finding time for this once again. Thank you so much for educating me on all of these various different topics. And thank you so much for the work that you do with Urbz.
Thank you, Sanchian. Yeah. And whenever a situation, becomes a little bit more kind of like manageable, you should come and visit the office in Dharavi. And of course, this is an invitation that we extend also to everybody who's listening to the podcast.
Oh, yes. I would love to. Yeah, I would literally jump on that.
Great.
And thank you so much for wonderful questions. These are really engaging questions. We really enjoyed answering them. Thank you so
thank
much.
you so much. Yeah, I remember when I was sort of drafting all the questions, I had like a lot more and they were much sort of bigger. And Matias was like, oh my God, do you want us to write a book? And I was like, because I know that this sort of can deserve, like, we can dedicate a season to this, like we could just sort of go really deep into this. So I'm really glad that you summarized and sort of presented all the work that you're doing so beautifully and succinctly. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye. Stay safe. Bye. And that marks the end of this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. You can find all the relevant links and handles to know more about our guest this week in the episode description. If you have any feedback, suggestions, requests, or simply just want to get in touch with us, then please do head over to our podcast website. We are available to flag and say hi to via Facebook, Instagram, or email. Thank you and see you next week.